Now, I hardly ever cover gaming leaks on this channel, but this new Pokemon rumor is something that simply can't be overlooked. Because if this is true, it'll change everything we thought we knew about Gen 10. Originating from Kura on Twitter and being corroborated by numerous sources associated with Centro Leaks, Pokemon Winds and Waves is set to feature 300 brand new Pokemon. The most new creatures ever revealed in a single generation by a long shot. Now, basically everyone in the Pokemon space is discussing the potential legitimacy of this rumor, but I wanted to take a different approach, because all this talk got me thinking, would 300 brand new Pokemon even work? Let's talk about it. To start us off, I want to get into the weeds of this a little bit and clarify what 300 new Pokemon actually means. There are reportedly 531 slots in the Gen 10 Pokédex, 307 of which are placeholders for new Pokemon species. Centro later confirmed that these 307 slots are composed of brand new Pokemon as well as regional forms. Gimmick forms like Mega Evolution or Gigantamax Pokemon are not included. It also doesn't include Pokemon like Alcremie, who have 63 different forms, or Spinda, who have, this number of forms. And all that's to say that when we're talking about 300 new Pokemon, we're actually talking about 300 new Pokemon. There's absolutely nothing to inflate this number like many other PokeTubers and Twitter users have already theorized. So again, assuming this is real, let's talk logistics. With 531 slots in the dex, we're looking at a split like this, where the white dots represent new Pokemon and the red dots represent returning Pokemon. As you can see, the new Pokemon clearly outnumber the returning ones, which is a series first. But keep in mind, this is before we factor in regional forms. The prevailing theory I've seen online is that there are 150 new Pokemon and 150 regional forms. But I honestly just don't see this as a possibility. Ever since the introduction of regional forms in Gen 7, we've seen 18 Alolan forms, 19 Galarian forms, 16 Hisuian forms, and only 4 Paldean forms. And in my opinion, the jump from just under 20 in most games to potentially over 100 in Winds and Waves is even more unrealistic than the prospect of getting 300 fully original Pokemon. And I know that as Pokemon fans, we tend to set ourselves up for disappointment, but really think about this for a second. Why would Game Freak waste their design talent on remaking old Pokemon when they could just as easily create all new ones? Increasing the total number of diverse Pokemon only creates more marketing opportunities. And as cute as he is, I don't see much fanfare or merch for Alolan Meowth compared to a new Pokemon in the same generation like Rockruff. Okay, so how many regional forms are there actually gonna be then? Well, the safe bet would be for me to guess something like 20, but I actually think there's gonna be a few more than that. Think about it. Ever since Dexit, each generation has had a nice round 400 Pokemon in its base game dex. This started because it was a little less than half of the total Pokemon that existed at the time of Gen 8. Since then, Game Freak has increased that number to over 1,000, so I think it's fair to say that we're due for a dex upgrade. However, I think they'll stick with that even number and have a total of 500 Pokemon in the Winds and Waves dex. But hold on, I just said that there were 531 total, so how could we have a 500 Pokemon dex with 531 slots? Well, it's pretty simple actually. I think this is because there are 31 regional forms, which take up slots on paper, but in the actual game will share a page of the Pokédex. Like how Wooper and Paldean Wooper are shown off in the same spot in Scarlet and Violet. 31 new forms also feels much more realistic compared to the 20 of previous games than the 150 that other fans are speculating. And factoring in those forms, represented by yellow dots, our deck split is starting to feel a little bit more realistic despite the unprecedented amount of new characters. And now that we have a pretty solid idea of how all of this is going to be laid out, the question has to be asked, is this really a good thing, or will it just make the game feel pretty bloated? To be honest, the first thing that came to my mind when I heard the news was Gen 5. In the original Black and White, Game Freak made the divisive decision to lock all of the returning Pokemon until after you beat the game, meaning you had to go through the main story with all new Pokemon. I find myself on the side of people who liked this change, and while I can certainly empathize with those who feel differently, I think this was a great way to introduce players who otherwise wouldn't care to check out the new cast of characters, especially given how many they introduced, as it currently holds the record for most new Pokemon in a single generation. It seems to me like the Winds and Waves dex is an attempt to recapture that same idea without relegating the veterans to being post-game content. Doing it this way just makes it statistically likely that most players will experience with and potentially be sold on new Pokemon. And in theory, this is a great strategy both as a business and for fans. I mean, it's pretty hard to complain about new content, right? Especially if that content is brand new lovable creatures. But I do see one potential problem here, and it's an issue that Black and White faced as well. How do you even make 300 brand new Pokemon? Look, Game Freak is an incredibly creative company with some great minds working non-stop to come up with new characters. But even as far back as Gen 5, they were struggling. A lot of the Pokemon in that game just reused old concepts from Gen 1, and they only had to do 150 designs. Now it's double the workload with even less to draw from since there have been 4 games worth of ideas used in the time since. I'm not saying that every Pokemon is gonna be a rehash or anything, but this gargantuan number does scare me a little bit. However, if I may be a little bit controversial, I'd say that recent Pokemon designs have done a much better job at pulling inspiration from cultural and environmental aspects of whatever part of the world that particular region is based on. I mean, we've gone from a water turtle and a fire lizard to a little crocodile guy based on a Spanish legend and a Mexican holiday, with a hobby for singing that's based on a completely different Spanish legend, and the fact that crocodiles are the most vocal reptiles in the world. And all that's complete with a funny ghost pepper pun as a nice little bow on top. In my opinion, running out of more traditional ideas has led to modern Pokemon designers getting remarkably in-depth with their inspirations. So honestly, I could see this going either way. Maybe 300 is too much, but if any team is gonna tackle it, this is the one to do it. But what do you think? Would 300 new Pokemon be a great feature, or are you a little bit more cautious? Be sure to let me know in the comments down below. I also want to give a massive shout out to my patrons who keep this channel going, and as always, please remember, believe to achieve.